Hi there, I'm here with my good friend Dan and colleague, and we've been geeking out about all kinds of good things to do with improving leadership, improving organizations, and we've just been talking about particularly the place of using instruments, using measures to track are people improving in their leadership. And a really interesting part of the conversation is where I think people tend to really misunderstand instruments. And I love instruments. I think, tracking data is great. And, we can baseline where someone's at and then remeasure them later on to see how they've improved. That's great. And of course, organizations super want that because they want to know that, how they're investing their development budgets is actually working. The problem is, though, that instruments are based on models that represent something. Instruments tend to be just sets of questions, that we ask people to kind of rate a particular individual around. And those questions are very ultimately subjective. Of course, I can, compare different people and I can start to get statistical reliability based on comparing different answers, but it's still only based on a particular model of leadership. In classic examples, the OCI from Human Synergistics, and then there's also the Leadership Circle, which I'm certified in. And I think these are great models, but they are just models. And the danger is that we kind of lose sight that they're models and we go, well, this means that this person is this type of leader, right? So, well, the model and asking people questions about the model, I think provokes some really interesting reflection. And I think that's really a lot of the benefit of the model. But if we get too fixated on the model, we kind of lose sight of the context, the assumptions behind the model, the context in which people are asking questions about the model. And we kind of treat the model as if it's reality. It's the classic kind of confusing the map for the territory mistake that I think we constantly make. So I'm going to pause at this point and just see if there's kind of stuff that you want to kind of add to what I've said.
Well, thanks, Khali. Fun being here. I sort of have a love-hate relationship with measurements, instruments, quantitative measures. I think the first concern is, are people going to be honest, or are they going to be fearful that they're being judged or assessed, which they are. So you're going to get distortion based on that. And you can make that even worse, if you like, by turning the measurements into targets. Right.
Yes.
And then the incentive is to be my best, to come across really well, or what I think is the case. Or if I say I'm filling in one of these instruments about someone else on my leadership team, I don't want them to look bad, or I don't want them to look good. So we get all these other confounding factors happening.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so it's not even just that it's a model, but it's also, there's the larger kind of social context of what people kind of think they should be answering, and they want to be nice and so on.
Yeah. Or what do I know? I'm being given a really detailed model of questions about some aspect that I may not have been paying attention to in my colleagues when I'm rating them, or if we've got some other relationship, like I'm coaching them. I've been known to refuse to fill in such assessments because I go, look, I'll give you feedback face to face and we can work on that stuff, but I don't want to be in this separate role as a judge.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that's I think such an important point, that we don't often know what people are thinking when they fill it in. Like, a lot of these types of instruments do have sections where you can just do open feedback and you get verbatims, and I think they're kind of a really super important part of it. But just there's so much kind of missing understanding of,
Yeah, I think where I want to go is also how much is my behaviour to do with the system that I'm embedded in. So when I think about what I get teams to do, it might be getting them to comment on how the system is working.
Yeah.
And
just gonna let the dog in.
That's a whole other aspect. And even then, you get the same. You get the same reactions. If I'm critical of the support systems which we've got set up in our organisation, will that be used to as fuel to make some positive change? Hello, pickles. Or is there a risk that I will be targeted for talking down and not being on brand or on the team?
Yes, yeah.
For naming the elephants in the room or measuring the height of the elephants in the room.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so like just to kind of paraphrase some of what you're saying, like there's all of that kind of the context once again of the person's work environment, the team they're part of, and how that's influencing how they're showing up. You know, so these instruments really are a measure of not just the person, but so much of their context, because that context is going to have a massive input to, you know, people's answers and how they're responding.
Yeah. And I think you make a good point there about the proxiness of these measures. I think something that would be good to talk about, Khali, would be where you're measuring direct physical things. And there's the analogy with sports. How fast did I run 100 meters, or how high did I jump? These are objective measures. A lot of what we try and measure in organizations are taking something quite subjective and whacking a scale on it and then trying to sense make around that abstraction. But I think you're doing some interesting things measuring physiological phenomena objectively, but then you're trying to correlate that with aspects of leadership.
Exactly. You know, this, and I get really excited here, right? Because we're getting a lot better at actually being able to measure important physiological metrics that I think are really important as part of leadership. You know, so a classic one is heart rate variability. You know, so I can measure how consistently someone's heart will speed up and slow down, which is basically a measure of autonomic nervous system balance, right? So, and that's then going to show up in terms of how composed I am as a leader, how resilient I am, you know, in response to stress. It's connected to positive affect, so it's also going to show up in terms of my ability to be in states of positivity, which of course are going to then come out in terms of how people are impacted. You know, and that's a really simple one to do. And then there's the brain. You know, I can kind of measure, say, the front left brain, and if the frequencies are a little bit low in that front left brain, that's going to be a measure of maybe someone's lack of motivation. That's kind of more connected to depressive type traits, you know, and people not kind of being fully leaned in and kind of engaged in what they're doing. So, and of course, and that stuff, you know, is very, you know, like it doesn't always exactly mean those things, but I think it does a lot more than what we see in these leadership instruments.
When you just drill into that a bit, when you do these kinds of measurements, and you the hypothesis is that they're related to these phenomena which we care about, are you using them compared to some external baseline or a person's own journey? So if they're in so over time, right, we'll take a baseline measurement, and then we think that it would be better if you could bring that down or raise that up over time, and we'll remeasure it another time and then try and correlate with the behavioral or emotional things. Yeah,
that's a great question. So, you know, the heart kind of rate variability stuff, in the kind of, let's say, the schools that I've studied in, you get a measure of coherence, which is basically a measure of how singular is the frequency. So the heart's going, if I get a really nice sine wave pattern, you know, in the heart, we can say that's kind of 100% coherent. So that one, let's say, is not so normative. It's not so, like, I think there are going to be normative databases that, you know, have us understand, like it's used a lot in recovery. So if I'm a athlete and I want to know when I can train hard, I look at my HRV, or if I've slept well. So there'll be normative stuff around that for sure. But I can get to some level of like percentage of coherence. Now, the other example that I gave, now that is based on a clinical normative kind of database. and this is kind of what's happening in the EEG world, as we're getting more and more of these databases that kind of have us start to understand quantitatively what's going on. But even those databases like can have hard things to kind of properly get your head around, because what population is the normative population, and of course EEG is used kind of a lot in the therapeutic world, and if I'm comparing someone whose brain I've measured to normal, well, our normal population actually has heaps of pathology in it, right? That's not properly diagnosed. So there's kind of, even that has its own kind of can of worms to deal with. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Let's see, is there anything else for us to kind of share in this space? Something I wanted to go back to a little bit is on this theme of normative databases, right? So in the leadership circle, they have a big normative database of leaders. So, and they tend to account a little bit for that thing of, well, I like this person, or they're my boss, and I don't want to score them too harshly, But if that's consistently done, then it's going to show up in those normative databases, and then I can start to get statistics comparing those results to the norms, and it will start to kind of cancel that stuff out to some degree. But it's kind of can be really confronting though for clients to like go, whoa, I scored really lowly there. But you go, and the score is based on a percentage compared to norms, right? But if I go and look at the original data, the scores were actually pretty good, So, and this is a really interesting aspect of using these types of instruments, right? Is, well, how do I interpret the data? Because there's so much of this contextuality to it that, interpreting it is actually really, really important.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up. I think there's a really interesting aspect to talk about, is that often these, you can tell me for the ones you're talking about, as to whether when I rate other people, am I doing it anonymously or not? My impression is that usually it's anonymous, even though it's within a small group, if it's leadership teams cross-assessing themselves. Would that be correct?
Oh, like in the leadership circle, you get to see, like, here is the data for all of my direct reports, and here's the data for all of the colleagues that rated me. So, and that tends to be whatever it is, a pool of a few people in each of those categories. So I don't know the individual, but I get a sense of what that group says. So I might be able to start making some guesses, but mostly not.
But the attempt is made to do it anonymously.
Yeah,
but it's a fairly small, so you
yes,
could.
Yeah.
So why is it being made anonymously? Because the hope is that people will feel safer to be more honest.
Yeah.
The alternative is to rate each other openly, which is fraught with risk. But if you have a certain level of mutual respect and likability, the great advantage of something like this is if it's open. Actually, I've never tried this, so don't try this at home. I've done sort of semi-open things like that. Is to have the discussion. Is to have the discussion, and I guess in my case where I've said, look, let's rate aspects of the system we're in. Or I've seen, if you go to the open systems theory, 6 criteria for happy individuals, and you say, well, I feel that I have too much autonomy, and Khali says that he has not enough autonomy, and we're on the same team. We're going, well, hang on, can we adjust together if we can be open and have a safe discussion about it? If not, then we've got a bigger problem. So there's this, how comfortable are we in using these measures, and how seriously do we take them, and can we look at them? So for that reason, I guess you can try. Well, what I see is these attempts at using anonymity to artificially increase safety, because I'm doing it behind a veil. An alternative is, if you've got a team that is working well together and they need more of a challenge, let's just do it in the open. But how many teams are ready for that, and how safe is it if you're coming
I think this is a really super awesome point. Like, in a way, these instruments wouldn't be needed if we were good at feedback, and of course that's a big if, because there's really subtle territories of feedback here, and it's natural and good that we want to kind of protect each other from the brutality possibly of how what we say might be received, So, but at the same time, if we learned to have good boundaries around that stuff, you know, and this is such an important piece of feedback, right? If I can take somebody says to me with a little bit of distance and kind of go, well, what might be true about that? And how can I have some curiosity, you know, around that? Well, can you give me an example? And what do you mean by that? And I can kind of discard the pieces that maybe don't fully fit, but actually with sincerity and kind of honesty go, well, what might be true for me there? Like those types of boundary skills, I think are really key to properly be able to do the types of processes that you're talking about where I can really give feedback. And those, you know, those skills are actually really lacking, generally speaking, in a lot of people. And it kind of takes quite a bit of self-esteem for those skills. It takes quite a bit of awareness of kind of data versus interpretation, and quite often people aren't that good at kind of making that distinction. But ideally, I think if we develop those skills, actually just openly giving each other feedback probably would be more valuable than these leadership instruments. And that's a bit of an irony in a way, you know, like ideally we wouldn't need them, you know. So maybe instead we should just focus on developing those skills and getting good at feedback, and then, you know, we wouldn't have to like take all this time to fill out these like crazy big surveys, you know, because we could just get feedback directly, you know. And this is in a way we're so oriented towards wanting quantitative data that we lose sight of actually how powerful qualitative data is if we actually can properly kind of engage with it and we have these skills to be able to. And I think that's a bit of a tragedy, actually, you know. And yeah,
perhaps so. And there's so many places we could go from that. Like qualitative data, of course, it's more time consuming, difficult to work with, and hence harder to scale, or you're going to have to throw away a lot of information when you go at scale, because how much can you take in? It's so rich. Then what do you do?
Yeah. Anyway, there's lots of interesting threads here and possibilities, like of things to keep talking about, but I think that's probably a pretty good kind of start for a conversation. So I'm hoping that whoever's watching this, that you find some value in the things that we've jammed out about here, and please write some comments and engage with us if you want to share your thoughts or ask questions. I want to kind of see the dialogue. So any last thoughts from you before we finish up?
I kind of enjoyed having Pickles on board. Pickles was a calming influence in a totally qualitative and non-quantitative way.
Yeah. She sat here like licking my hands in front of her, like, whoa, okay.
And perhaps Pickles could be a feature of future calls.
Yeah.
Thanks, Khali.
Sweet. Thanks, Dan.